Hello, and welcome to Living with My Subject. This event is part of the inaugural Sussex Festival of Ideas, and as the artistic director for the festival, I would like to thank you for taking the time to join us for this and any other events that you're able to attend. We're really excited to be able to put on a festival that showcases a wide range of activities right across the media, arts, and humanities. This festival is a dynamic and engaging festival with a program full of talks, events and activities, participatory, and a bit more laid back. So you might find something else, and we encourage you to visit the festival website to see what appeals to you. This festival has been produced by the newly formed School of Media, Arts, and Humanities at Sussex University. A bit of housekeeping. The event's being recorded, and we will post the event to our festival website shortly after the festival concludes. You as audience members won't be visible, but I do need to let you know. And live captioning is available and can be accessed by pressing the live transcript button that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. There will be a Q&A afterwards, and at the bottom of your screen, you'll also see a Q&A section. And you can post questions there from the panel. If you'd like to ask your question via microphone, you can make that known in your question in the Q&A panel as well. And again, we'll come to questions from the Q&A panel at the end of the session. One final bit of housekeeping. A member of our festival's team may contact you after the festival to ask what you thought. And if you don't wish to be contacted, then just get in touch with us and let us know. You can contact any member of the festival team from the festival website or the School of Media, Arts, and Humanities itself. And you'll find that on the same website where you found the link to attend this session. If that's enough from me. I'd like to hand over to my colleague, the esteemed and frankly awesome Ivor Gaber. Thanks.
Awesome. I like that. Thank you very much, Mary Agnes. This is the Local Boy Makes Good slot. I'm really pleased to have as our speaker Adam Sisman, who was a student here in the mists of time, 1972 to 75, when Sussex was still in black and white and Channel 4 hadn't been invented. Adam studied history here, and by his own admission, he was a lazy student, and he ended up where all lazy students end up. He ended up driving a minicab as his first job. However, the creative juices could not be suppressed, and he managed to get a foothold into publishing, where he worked for many years, eventually setting up his own business. Whilst he was doing that, publishing other people's works, it occurred to him that maybe he had something interesting to say. And he discovered through a mutual friend that the legendary historian, who I fear is not so legendary these days because for some reason he's faded, but called A.J.P. Taylor, Britain's first telly-don, had not had a biography written about him. And Adam started to research that and decided, yes, this was an interesting man. Since then, he has published a number of biographies. John le Carré is his latest. That was published in 2015, but it was written and published when le Carré was still alive. Adam is now working on a new edition, which should be out next year. He's going to talk about most of the biographies you can use. The one he's not going to talk about is the one I just finished, which is absolutely The Professor and the Parson, about somebody you wouldn't have heard of, but an absolutely amazing story about an incredible con man. And it's delicious because he's conned academics, dare I say, bishops, dare I say, and most other people he came in contact with. So it's a delightful, fun read. The others are a good read as well, but fun is the essence there. Anyway, enough from me. We're going to hear from Adam, whose subject, his talk is Living with My Subject, Dr. Johnson, Hugh Trevor-Roper, John le Carré, and me. Adam, looking forward to hearing from you. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Ivor. Yes, that's my subject, and I'll kick straight in. Throughout his great biography of Samuel Johnson, James Boswell records numerous conversations with his friends. Several of those concerned the subject of biography itself. Boswell quotes Johnson as saying that nobody can write the life of a man but those who have not eaten, he said eat, and drunk and lived in social intercourse with him. This was only a limitation, as Johnson would no doubt have conceded had Boswell challenged him. Johnson himself was to write short biographies of those whom he had never met in his Lives of the Poets. Nowadays, we think of it as the norm for the biographer to contemplate his or her subject from a distance, with scholarly detachment, one might say. But even when Johnson seems dogmatic to the point of absurdity, his words are worthy of careful consideration. Rarely did he make a remark that did not contain an important truth. In quoting these words of Johnson's, Boswell is reminding his readers that he himself had eaten and drunk and lived in social intercourse with his subject. Indeed, he tells us that they were taking tea together in his own lodgings when Johnson spoke them. Far from wanting to challenge Johnson's assertion, Boswell means to emphasize the superiority of his own qualifications over those of rival biographers who had been quicker into print than he had. In case we've missed the point, Boswell returns to it later on. We talked of biography, he tells us, during a visit to Oxford with Johnson. It is rarely well executed, he quotes Johnson as saying. Those only who live with a man can write his life with any genuine exactness and discrimination. Johnson goes on to say that even of those who have lived with a man, few have the discernment to remark what is interesting about him. I can testify to this from my own experience as a biographer. All too often, I have travelled expectantly to meet an informant who's told me, "Ah, yes, X, I knew him well," and then have been disappointed to find that he or she can tell me nothing about X but mere commonplaces, stuff I knew already. Most of us know far less about even close friends than we like to imagine. It's probably worth making a distinction at this early stage between biography and memoir, a distinction that was less apparent in Johnson's day. Indeed, it was Boswell who helped to distinguish the two. I think we can say that biography aspires to tell the whole truth about an individual, while memoir, being no more than one person's memories, is less ambitious. Biography attempts to be objective, memoir is subjective. Memoir relies on reminiscence, but biography requires research. Today, I want to explore what difference it makes when a biographer knows or has known his or her subject personally, as Johnson advocated. As my title suggests, parts of this talk are based on my own experience. It's not difficult to see the advantages to a biographer in being able to observe one's subject at close hand, to question one's subject about the past, as Boswell did of Johnson, to be granted introductions to friends and family, and access to private papers, and perhaps even to receive feedback from one's subject on what one has written. But equally, it is easy to see how intimacy with one's subject could be distorting, inhibiting, or restrictive. My first biography was of a man whom I had never met, and indeed never even caught sight of except on television, the historian A.J.P. Taylor. I began to write about him soon after his death in 1990, and I was surprised and even alarmed to find how quickly I became aware of aspects of his past and his behaviour which not even his family knew. It occurred to me for the first time that those close to a person are less likely to be able to see that person in the round. The point was reinforced in a conversation with another historian of Taylor's generation, Raymond Carre. He and I were discussing the charismatic Labour politician Tony Crosland, whom Carre had known as a young don in Oxford immediately after the war. Crosland's biography had been written by his widow, Susan. Now, one might think that a wife would know as much about her husband as anybody else, and perhaps more. But Carre disabused me of this naive assumption. It was just because she was his wife, he told me, that he had felt unable to confide to her a salient fact about the young Crosland, that he swung both ways, as Carre put it. A.J.P. Taylor himself had written two biographies, one of someone who had died before he was born, the Prussian Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, and one of someone whom he'd come to know well, too well in the view of some, who disapproved of his fondness for the wicked old press magnate, Lord Beaverbrook. More than a dozen years after my book on Taylor appeared, I would write a biography of another historian, Hugh Trevor-Roper. In 1957, Trevor-Roper had become Regius Professor of Modern History at Oxford, a post which some thought should have gone to Taylor. This is not normally an appointment that attracts much attention outside the academic world, but in 1957 it was headline news. 4 years later, Taylor and Trevor-Roper took opposite sides in a heated controversy over the origins of the Second World War, debating the subject on television as well as in print. As a result, the two men became firmly established in the public mind as rivals, even as enemies. Having written biographies of both, I am often asked where my sympathies lie. It's a question that I find impossible to answer, complicated by the fact that I knew Trevor-Roper personally, unlike Taylor. My next biography was a biography of the novelist John le Carré. I've certainly eaten and drunk with le Carré, who was something of a bon viveur. Indeed, I sometimes drank more than I should have done. Le Carré, whose real name was David Cornwall, could be a wonderful companion, generous, sophisticated, and amusing. In getting to know him, I was conscious of the danger of becoming enamored of my subject. I was careful to keep refrigerated in the chamber of my heart the splinter of ice that, according to Graham Greene, every writer needs. In this talk, I mean to concentrate especially on Boswell's great book, the Uber Biography. Anyone with an interest in biography soon becomes interested in the life of Johnson. It stands next to other biographies as Shakespeare stands next beside other playwrights, towering above them all. For A.J.P. Taylor, The Life of Johnson was my favourite book, as it has been for many thousands of others in the 230 years since it was published. Boswell is the first of biographers, wrote the historian Macaulay, Lord Macaulay. He has no second. He compared Boswell to the champion racehorse Eclipse. He has outdistanced all his competitors so decidedly that it is not worthwhile to place them. Eclipse is first and the rest nowhere. No other biography has given so much pleasure. No other biographer has created such a vivid central character. It has become a truism that, as a result of Boswell's extraordinary biography, Samuel Johnson is better known to us than any other man in history. But as well as being a celebrated and much-loved book, The Life of Johnson is a work that raises fundamental questions about the nature of biography itself. Is it possible for a biographer to understand fully another human being? However careful and diligent the writer, can biography be accurate, that is, faithful to life? Everybody knows Dr. Johnson, or so we think. But is the man we know from the pages of Boswell's book the same Johnson that strode the streets of London 250 years ago? The Life of Johnson set a new standard for biography. It was written at a time when most authors, including even Johnson himself, were content to rely on previous authorities or just on memory as a source. Boswell deplored the habit of introducing anecdotes, facts, and even quotations with phrases such as, "I think I have read," or "if I remember right," when the originals were available to be consulted. He took unprecedented pains to verify his sources. Were I to detail the books which I have consulted and the inquiries which I found necessary to make by various channels, I should probably be thought ridiculously ostentatious, he wrote in the advertisement to the first edition of The Life of Johnson. Let me only observe, as a specimen of my trouble, that I have sometimes been obliged to run half over London in order to fix a date correctly, which, when I had accomplished, I well knew would obtain me no praise, though a failure might have been to my discredit. In The Life of Johnson and its predecessor, the Journal of the Tour to the Hebrides with Samuel Johnson, Boswell made a heroic attempt to display what he called the real Johnson, Johnson as he really was. Very early on, beginning before the two had met, when he stumbled across the Rambler essays in his father's library, Boswell had formed a powerful picture of Johnson's character. Solemn, dignified, combative, incorruptible, pious, rational, endowed with unrivaled intellectual powers, a king of men. After they met, and as Johnson became familiar to him, this picture became clearer still. His biography of Johnson was intended to communicate this vision. He rejected Johnsonian anecdotes which seemed to him uncharacteristic. Boswell reconstructed Johnson's conversations from his own records. He collected memorabilia of Johnson from every possible source. He insisted that everything relevant to so great a man is worth observing. And though much ridicule for it, he described how Johnson dressed, what he ate, and how he behaved. The result is that Johnson, a remote, venerable figure to most of his contemporaries, appears to us as an intimate. Boswell's ambition was nothing less than to resuscitate his dead friend in print. Indeed, so he claimed, had Johnson's other friends been as thorough in recording what he said and did, he might have been almost entirely preserved. As it was, Boswell boasted that in his biography, Johnson might be seen more completely than any man who ever lived. However, despite Boswell's determination to gather up every remaining scrap of information about his subject, aspects of Johnson's life were forever hidden from him. His behavior when alone with a woman, for example. Then there was a chronological problem, that the two men did not meet until Johnson was 53. And though Boswell came to know Johnson very well, indeed afterwards, his knowledge was inevitably circumscribed. In his biography, Boswell pays much less attention to the period of Johnson's life before they met. His subject's first 53 years take up less than 1/5 of his book, the remaining 21 years, the remaining 4/5. The first meeting between the biographer and his subject is one of the book's set pieces, and from this point on, the reader is almost constantly aware of Boswell at Johnson's side. Boswell was limited too by his own limitations. He could not imagine what he could not comprehend. Like all biographers, he could show only what he could see. The man we come to know in the pages of Boswell's book is, so far as we can tell, faithful to life, but only to the life that Boswell witnessed and understood. Though the Samuel Johnson evoked in Boswell's biography is one of the most powerful personalities in literature, as real as any character in fiction, he never quite escapes from his disciple. James Boswell, from his disciple James Boswell, they remain as much a pair as Don Quixote and Sancho Panza, or Holmes and Watson. Indeed, much of the pleasure in reading the life of Johnson comes from the presence of Boswell as narrator, just as the presence of Watson, whom Holmes compared to Boswell, supplies much of the pleasure to be found in the Sherlock Holmes stories. There are passages where Johnson appears to be sharing a confidence with the reader, while Boswell struggles to keep up, as if the writer were the last one to be let in on the joke. Johnson's amusement shines through the surface of Boswell's prose. On the other hand, there are passages in which Boswell appears almost like a ventriloquist, putting words into Johnson's mouth. He became adept at steering the conversation in directions that would stimulate Johnson to say something memorable. He was proud of this ability, though it often required him to play the straight man alongside Johnson, the butt of Johnson's wit. He tried to orchestrate scenarios to see how Johnson would perform in them, encounters with individuals who would stimulate Johnson into some interesting response, for example. In this sense, Boswell was creating his own copy, the reporter making news for himself. Boswell kept a record of what Johnson and others had said in brief memoranda, noted down as soon as possible afterwards, later written up in a journal, which eventually became a principal source for his biography. A note in Boswell's journal for the 20th of October, 1764, provides an insight into the way he worked. My method is to make a memorandum every night of what I have seen during the day. By this means I have my materials always secured. Sometimes I'm 3, 4, 5 days without journalizing. When I have time and spirits, I bring up this my journal as well as I can. Some of these memoranda have survived, and they show Boswell using a form of rapid and abbreviated writing. He called these condensed notes portable soup. They were a kind of stock cube from which he could make up a broth when the time came to feed. He needed only to put down a few words on paper, the heads of the conversation, to be able to retrieve the rest later. Then he would expand the notes into a fully written form when he had leisure to do so. Boswell had a remarkable memory. Often only a brief note would suffice to prompt the recall of a long conversation, and he was able to write it up into a passage 10 or 20 times its length. The practice of keeping a journal over many years had trained him to formulate in advance what he might write. This process was most successful when he knew the individuals whose speech he was recording and was familiar with the way they talked. An exceptionally skillful mimic, he had a keen ear for characteristic habits of speech. When he first came to know Johnson, Boswell was so struck by his extraordinary colloquial talents that he found it extremely difficult to recollect afterwards what Johnson had said. Boswell's record of their first meeting in Tom Davies's Covent Garden bookshop, following the dramatic opening exchange, is little more than a set of disconnected quotes. But later, when my mind was, as it were, strongly impregnated with the Johnsonian ether, I could, with much more facility and exactness, carry in my memory and commit to paper the exuberant variety of his wisdom and wit. Strongly impregnated with the Johnsonian ether. Boswell spent so much time in the company of his subject that Johnson's forms of speech, even the patterns of his thought, became deeply imprinted in his mind. It is amazing how a mimic can give you not only the gestures and voice of a person whom he represents, but even what a person would say on any particular subject, he reflected on one occasion to Johnson. It is only fair to add that Johnson was sceptical of this claim. Boswell's technique for preserving the conversation of Johnson and others was not what it seemed. What appeared as mere verbatim recording was in reality a much more complex process, one at least partly reliant on Boswell's memory. And though his memory was exceptional, it was nevertheless fallible and susceptible to a variety of distorting influences. What he remembered could never be exactly what he had heard. Then there would always be gaps in his memory that he needed filling, and for that matter, non sequiturs in Johnson's conversation that required a link to make sense on the page. Boswell's skill was to sustain the illusion that what he wrote was just what Johnson had said. In this sleight of hand, he was triumphantly successful. His artistry concealed the extent of his invention. The naivety he portrayed reinforced the sense of authenticity he wished to convey. To supplement his own record of Johnson's conversations, Boswell drew on collections of Johnsonian bon mots and anecdotes from others, particularly from those who had known Johnson before he had done. Boswell admitted in The Life that he had rewritten some of these sayings of Johnson's past into what he considered to be the authentic Johnsonian style. Much of this was guesswork. In trying to decide what Johnson might actually have said, Boswell had to reconcile the miscellaneous text he had been given with the style of the man he knew. This process carried the risk of distortion. Though Boswell had known Johnson very well indeed, there were sides to the man that were always hidden from him, as I've already remarked. And knowing Boswell's reverence for him, Johnson presented a more solemn figure to the earnest young man than he sometimes did when Boswell was absent. The way that Johnson spoke when Boswell was present was not the way that he always spoke. Johnson was aware that Boswell was recording what he said, and this knowledge in itself may have influenced the way he talked when they were together. Boswell was steeped in Johnson's writings and used these to help him recapture what Johnson might have said. But written prose is different from speech, so that in repeating what Johnson had said, there was a tendency to make it more measured, more sonorous, and more impressive than it had been in reality, and to emphasize its rhetorical aspects. For example, his habit of beginning a sentence with "Sir." Johnson's manner of speaking eventually became something of a caricature, easily imitated. Boswell noticed that Johnson seemed to take a pleasure in speaking in his own style. When Johnson caught himself carelessly missing it, he would repeat the thought translated into a more rounded, pronounced sentence. Commenting on a play, for example, he first observed that it has not wit enough to keep it sweet, and then corrected what he had said to, "It has not vitality enough to preserve it from putrefaction." There was an element of self-parody in this, of course. As he became famous, Johnson developed an ironic attitude towards his own celebrity. Much of this was lost on Boswell. In 1887, almost 100 years after the Life was first published, George Birkbeck Hill produced an edition of the Life of Johnson in 6 volumes, which in its revised form has become regarded as the standard scholarly edition. Hill defended Boswell from his detractors. In particular, he supported Boswell's claim to have made an authentic record of Johnson's conversation. He produced hundreds of footnotes demonstrating the similarities between what Johnson had written and what Boswell had reported him to say. In Hill's view, such parallels buttressed Boswell's claim to authenticity. In fact, though much of Johnson's conversation had been recorded soon afterwards, much of it had been reconstructed months or even years afterwards, and both Boswell and his editor, Edmund Malone, had used their familiarity with Johnson's writing to fill out the gaps in Boswell's record, paraphrasing what Johnson had written into direct speech. It was therefore scarcely surprising that Hill should have found similarities between Boswell's record of Johnson's conversation and Johnson's writings. Unknowingly, he had followed the route they had taken, but in the opposite direction. To me, this is reminiscent of the episode of the Hitler Diaries, when handwriting experts testified that the documents produced by Stern magazine were authentic after comparing them with other samples of the Führer's handwriting, not realizing that these two were the work of the same forger. While he labored on his manuscript, Boswell drew on yet another source of Johnsonian material, his own memory. He had astonishing powers of recall. A quarter of a century after an evening when he had walked arm in arm with Johnson in Greenwich Park, he remembered that it had been cold enough as to make him shiver, and much else besides, enough to fill 4 new paragraphs. Throughout the book, he was able to add details which he had failed to record in his journal at the time. His journal in Holland for 1763-4, which had begun with his departure from London together with Johnson to the coast, had been lost, but with the help of his surviving rough notes, he found that he was able to reconstruct a lively narrative of their journey to Harwich, containing some dramatic scenes and characteristic dialogue. In this case, the act of writing his journal had helped to preserve events in his memory, even though the journal itself had gone missing 25 years before. Boswell had never written up that part of his journal containing the famous dinner on the 15th of May, 1776, in which he introduced Johnson to John Wilkes, the radical rake. His only record of this occasion were some brief notes, but he drew on these more than a dozen years later to produce an account of approximately 4,000 words, a scene as entertaining as any in the life of Johnson. The special flavour of the life of Johnson derives from the fact that the writer is a character in his own book. The very process of biography is dramatised. Readers see Boswell coming to London in the hope of meeting Johnson, writing him letters that he did not send, contemplating writing his life, and proposing the idea to him very tentatively. It is like watching a play when you can see the stagehands, the actors waiting to come on, and indeed the playwright scribbling last-minute revisions in the wings. Apparently everything is on view, but the more that can be seen, the less obvious it becomes where the true drama is taking place. Johnson himself was deeply interested in biography. He told a gathering at the Mitre Tavern that he loved the biographical part of literature most. Isaac Walton's Lives was one of his favourite books. No species of writing seems more worthy of cultivation, he wrote in a Rambler essay devoted to the topic. In Johnson's time, biography was still an emerging form, though one rapidly gaining in popularity. Many of those in his circle were writing or would write biographies. But when Johnson first turned his mind to the subject, biographical models were thin on the ground. Biography was in its infancy. Nobody quite knew how the baby would turn out, or even who its parents were. On their journey to the Hebrides, Johnson remarked to Boswell that he did not know any literary man's life in England well written. Literary biographies in Johnson's time tended to be brief, usually consisting of no more than a summary of the external events of the writer's life, often prefixed to an edition of his works. Few biographers attempted to probe the inner life of their subjects, to analyze the writings critically, or to illuminate the work in the light of the life. I esteem biography as giving us what comes close to ourselves, what we can turn to use, Johnson told Boswell during their tour of Scotland in the autumn of 1773. He believed in the power of example, the value of learning about other men's lives so that one might live one's own life better. His life of his friend Richard Savage was a morality tale, an account of how a man of talent and even genius could be dragged down by the combination of unlucky circumstance and flaws in his character. This was the book that popularized the myth of the struggling writer eking out a mean living in Grub Street, where poets starved in squalid garrets. The fact that Savage had been Johnson's friend and companion added a sharp point to the story. There were qualities in Johnson's book that few other writers could exhibit: compassion for Savage's suffering, sympathy for his plight, understanding of his circumstances. Johnson had been there. Like Savage, he had touched bottom, but unlike Savage, he had come up again. If biography was to teach men and women how to live, it followed that it should be realistic. Johnson did not share the general belief that respect for the dead required that their faults should be suppressed or glossed over. On the contrary, if nothing but the bright side of characters should be shown, we should sit down in despondency and think it utterly impossible to imitate them in anything. Just as the new fiction of Richardson and Fielding was becoming more realistic, so too should biography. Readers should be presented with the unvarnished truth. Uniform panegyric made all individuals seem the same. In his Rambler essay on biography, Johnson challenged the orthodoxy that the biographer should conceal the failings of his subject. If we owe regard to the memory of the dead, there is yet more respect to be paid to knowledge, to virtue, and to truth. Boswell followed Johnson's example, quoting Johnson's words in his support. I profess to write not his panegyric, but his life, which, great and good though he was, must not be supposed to be entirely perfect. In every picture, Boswell insisted, there should be shade as well as light. He planned that all of Johnson's faults, his prejudices, his ferocity in conversation, his quick temper, his susceptibility to flattery, his indolence, his slovenly dress, and even his unpleasant table manners, should be shown in his biography, but displayed so that their insignificance beside his great and good qualities would be apparent. Boswell was the first biographer to attempt to tell the whole truth about his subjects, to portray his lapses, his blemishes, and his weaknesses, as well as his great qualities, an aim we take for granted today, but in Boswell's time a startling innovation. Like Johnson, Boswell too was interested in manners and behavior. He delighted in those idiosyncrasies which provided clues to a man's character. He planned to fill his biography with such details, trivial in themselves, but characteristic of Johnson. He frequently used the analogy of a Flemish painting, the work of artists such as Rembrandt, Vermeer, or Van Dyck, whose mastery of detail represented a pinnacle of verisimilitude. With what smaller speck does a painter give life to an eye? He exclaimed. As with painting, so with biography. The speck of detail would bring the portrait to life. In particular, Boswell would stress the physical appearance of his subject, a huge, uncouth figure with a little dark wig which scarcely covered his head and his clothes hanging loose about him. Such descriptions, scattered throughout the life of Johnson, would fix an indelible impression in the reader's mind, so powerful that it could be manipulated to convey an immediate sense of any encounter involving Johnson, with the addition of only minimal detail. I alluded earlier to my own experience of living with my subject, and I want now to return to this, beginning by outlining my relations with Hugh Trevor-Roper. Incidentally, Trevor-Roper greatly enjoyed reading Boswell and reviewed several volumes of his journals as they were published in the Yale edition in the 1970s. When, after his death, I was one of a handful of friends invited to choose a book from his library, I selected a volume of Boswell's correspondence. I first met Trevor-Roper at an Oxford party in 1977. I was then in my early 20s, a junior editor with Oxford University Press, my first serious job after leaving Sussex 2 years before. I had forgotten the circumstances of this meeting until almost 30 years later, when I found in the OUP archive a letter I wrote to him the next day. As I recall the event, an exciting one for me, not least because I also met Isaiah Berlin for the first time, I remembered that I had begun the conversation cautiously, having been warned that Trevor-Roper could be acerbic, but I found him surprisingly affable. Subsequently, I invited him to lunch with 2 of my colleagues, which turned out to be a stiff occasion. Only later did it occur to me that this eminent man, so obviously my senior, might be shy, causing him to retreat behind a screen of reserve. We were in sporadic touch over the next dozen years as I pursued my early career in publishing. I renewed contact with him in 1990, soon after I began work on my first book, the biography of A.J.P. Taylor, that I mentioned earlier. Trevor-Roper generously granted me several interviews, lent me copies of his letters from Taylor and other relevant documents, and commented on a draft of my book. "I have read it with great interest and qualified pleasure," he wrote, qualified only because it is a melancholy as well as a fascinating story. After my book was published in 1994, Trevor-Roper reviewed it favourably, I'm pleased to say, in the Sunday Telegraph. He even consented to take part in a debate with me at the Oxford Union, a rerun of the famous debate with Taylor on the origins of the Second World War. Thinking back on this event now, I am astonished that he should have agreed to participate, but I suppose it may have appealed to his sense of fun. The debate was good-humoured, and I remember that we had dinner together afterwards with our wives at the Randolph Hotel. By this time, as I have indicated, we'd become friendly, and I visited him now and then at his house, the old rectory in Didcot. One cold winter morning, I arrived to find Trevor-Roper and his wife Zandra, both then in their 80s, in a state of agitated distress, as water from a burst pipe streamed down the wall of their dining room, damaging wallpaper and pictures. I am no plumber, but I climbed into the roof space and succeeded in stopping the leak. After Zandra went into a nursing home and subsequently died, I visited Trevor-Roper more often. I remember driving him to see her in her nursing home and to his own hospital appointments, and dining with him at High Table in Oxford and at his home in Didcot. Though by this time almost completely blind, he was determined to continue an independent existence and insisted on cooking me meals, refusing any offer of help. Watching him trying to light his antiquated gas cooker was an alarming experience. He would turn on the gas, strike a match, and then stoop to peer at the burners, waving the match in what he imagined was the right place, until the gas would catch light with a whoosh, and the elderly historian would spring backwards to avoid the jet of flame. Trevor-Roper found it increasingly difficult to read, and eventually impossible, so that visitors would often read aloud to him, sitting in front of the gas fire in his study. Of course, reading aloud in this way was very time-consuming, and while Trevor-Roper had several regular readers, he was forced to ration his reading severely. I was therefore flattered when he selected my Boswell's Presumptuous Task as one of the books he wanted to have read to him. At some stage, the possibility arose that I might write his life. Until I was well advanced in the task, I had persuaded myself that the proposal came from him. But correspondence I found in his archive indicates that it came from me. This was a salutary reminder of the unreliability of memory. In any case, he did not actively discourage this tentative suggestion. "There is no one whom I would like as my biographer better than you," he wrote. "But I really doubt whether I merit a biography at all. What is there to say?" In another letter, written a year or so later, he wrote that he was frightened of what he called your strange project. "My life has been totally conventional and uninteresting," he protested. "There is nothing to commemorate. I agree with Voltaire, la vie d'un écrivain sédentaire est dans ses écrits, and my écrits are very slender." I thought he was wrong and persisted. We talked regularly about his past, and he offered me glimpses of his dauntingly voluminous archive. He introduced me to his friend and literary executor, Blair Worden, who encouraged me to write the book. Both insisted that I should have free rein to write whatever I liked. Trevor-Roper did not like being treated with too much reverence and often quoted Gibbon's preference for praise, seasoned with a reasonable admixture of acid. I last saw him about 10 days before his death in 2003. He was then in a hospice and aware that the end was near, but he remained interested in the outside world to the last. "What news?" he would often ask, "from the Republic of Letters?" I was never convinced that I was qualified to answer this question. When my biography of Trevor-Roper was published in 2010, I thought it only honest to admit that I might have been influenced in my writing by feelings of loyalty, affection, and gratitude. It would have been false to deny the existence of such feelings, and I left it to the reader to decide whether these had been a help or a hindrance in my understanding of his character. But though I had known Trevor-Roper personally, and so I thought quite well, I came to know him much more intimately after his death. In his archive, I could find revealing letters and other documents, including autobiographical drafts and diaries. Reading these over a prolonged period of time left a deep impression on my mind. As I read his words, I could hear Trevor-Roper's voice in my head. And as I became familiar with the context in which the letters were written, I found that I could identify the references in them, and even to some extent, anticipate what he might write. I had found the same when I was researching my biography of A.J.P. Taylor. No doubt the effect was more pronounced because both were such distinctive writers. In each case, their personalities were as plain to me as their handwriting. In Taylor's case, I gained a powerful sense of the character of a man whom I had never known. And in Trevor-Roper's archive, I became familiar with the younger Hugh, more brash and arrogant than the self-deprecating, ironic individual I had known in old age, humbled perhaps by the chastening experience of the Hitler Diaries fraud. While writing my life of John le Carré, I had access to his archives, his manuscripts in the Bodleian Library in Oxford, and his personal archive in a garage at his home on a Cornish cliff overlooking the Atlantic. I spent many hours in his company, questioning him at length about his past. Of course, this is a privilege for a biographer. But it surprised me how often David, as I came to know him, told me stories that I knew already, and sometimes ones that I knew to be untrue. One instance of this, trivial in itself, nevertheless struck me forcibly. Over lunch, in a Hampstead restaurant, David began to tell me how it had come about that he had gone to teach at Eton after leaving Oxford. I knew that his account was inaccurate, having recently read some correspondence with the headmaster of Eton in the Lincoln College archives, and I rather rudely interrupted his story to tell him so. He was shaken, almost shocked. It was apparent to me that he had convinced himself that his account was true and was disconcerted to discover that he was mistaken. I have found that very few people are reliable sources to their own histories. Most, if not all of us, are constantly reworking the past in an attempt to make sense of the present. In le Carré's case, this process was especially active because he repeatedly drew on the well of his own experiences for his novels. In the narrative of his life, fact and fiction became intertwined. Earlier in this talk, I touched on the distinction between biography and memoir. 10 days before my biography was published, it was announced that le Carré was to publish a memoir. "He's trying to wrest back control of the agenda," commented my editor. Since then, it has often been suggested to me that this was an unhelpful act, even perhaps an unfriendly one. A degree of disgruntlement on David's part would not be surprising. Though my biography was written with my subject's cooperation, it would be disingenuous to pretend that there was no strain between us during the years I was writing it. I don't think that I would have been doing my job properly if there hadn't been. I can only imagine how hard it was for him to have a comparative stranger explore every room in his life, from attic to basement, to expose his mistakes and quarrels, and to probe away at his sore spots. "I think our continuing relationship is an achievement in itself," he wrote to me in 2014. So I was pleased to receive a gracious letter from him on the day my biography was published, and further pleased a year or so later to receive an inscribed copy of his memoir, The Pigeon Tunnel, a few days before it appeared in the shops. This book had a long history. He had been toying with the idea of writing some kind of memoir for more than half a century. In fact, as long as he'd been writing novels, and had made at least 2 previous attempts at it, in 1979 and again in 2001. In retrospect, I wondered whether my book might have been the catalyst that enabled him finally to write his. The Pigeon Tunnel is subtitled Stories from a Life. The introduction contains a passing reference to my book. A recently published account of my life offers thumbnail versions of 1 or 2 of the stories, so it naturally pleases me to reclaim them as my own, tell them in my own voice, and invest them as best I can with my own feelings. There is an element of pulling rank in this statement. These are my stories, he is saying, and I can tell them best. And it is undeniable that he tells them very well. In The Pigeon Tunnel, le Carré makes no claim to factual accuracy. For the creative writer, he writes in his introduction, fact is raw material, not his taskmaster, but his instrument, and his job is to make it sing. Real truth lies, if anywhere, not in the facts, but in nuance. Well, this reads well enough, but what does it mean in practice? While at work on his life, I found myself repeatedly questioning the veracity of what I was being told, and I found myself doing so again in reading The Pigeon Tunnel. For example, le Carré provides a charming account of a visit to Paris at the age of only 16, dispatched by his father to recover money from the Panamanian ambassador, a grey-haired count. The door to the elegant house is opened by the most desirable woman I'd ever seen, he writes, and he describes how she comes on to him throughout the remainder of the evening, squeezing his hand, caressing his leg, and nuzzling his ear as they sip daiquiris, discuss business, and dine in a favorite Russian restaurant. Back at the house, the Count announces that they are ready for bed, and the Countess indicates that the young guest should join them there. The schoolboy stumbles through his excuses and flees. Well, as told in The Pigeon Tunnel, this is a delightful story of innocence and naughtiness. My difficulty with it is that he had given an account of the visit before with none of the nuance. In that version, there was no suggestion of seduction. The Countess was dismissed in a single phrase, and David was accompanied throughout by his elder brother. So, which are we to believe? To return to Johnson's precept, which I cited at the beginning of this talk, I think we can say without hesitation that he was wrong. Of course it is possible to write the life of a man or a woman without having eaten and drunk and lived in social intercourse with him or her. As I have tried to show, contact with one's subject, though useful, is not as useful as one might imagine. On the other hand, Boswell's masterpiece could only have been written by someone who had lived alongside his subject in the manner that Johnson advocated. There is, of course, another sense in which biographers are living with their subjects. As we write biographies, we are always thinking about our subjects, reading their words and considering their careers, their achievements, and their failures. For myself, I know that when writing a biography, I quickly reach a point where everything seems relevant to my subject, and my subject seems relevant to everything. My children mock me for this trait. Though it seems to me inevitable and probably helpful for biographers to become so obsessed, at least for a limited period. I recall a comment of A.J.P. Taylor's in his introduction to his Life of Beaverbrook. Now that I've learnt to know him better from his records, I love him even more. But this obsession with one's subject fades very quickly when one stops working on a biography. It is an occupational hazard for biographers that by the time a book is published, one is usually thinking about someone else. I seem to have been enslaved to that old man forever, Taylor complained to his wife, only 2 years after his Life of Beaverbrook appeared. Of course I did it because I loved him, but that memory fades too. Now I often remember the times when I found him exasperating and wondered why I ever wasted my time in his company. Some years ago, I read another biography of A.J.P. Taylor by an author whom I will not name. It seemed to me uninspiring, and I abandoned the book halfway through. I found myself wondering, why was I ever interested in this man? He emerged from the pages of the biography as an unhappy, mean-minded, and self-serving. Why had I devoted several years of my life to him? Trying to answer these questions, I pulled off the shelves a copy of my own book, which had remained unopened for some years, and started reading. At once my subject sprang to life, and I saw again what a fascinating and delightful individual he had been. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much, Adam. Interesting note to end on, which begs a number of questions about the extent to which you need to like your subject, although it might be slightly problematic with Boswell and Johnson. Please,
well, actually, sorry to interrupt you there, but I mean, one of the reviewers of my book said the word he used to describe Boswell was adorable. There is a sense in which you do kind of become, you can like figures even remotely.
Well, I'll ask. I'm inviting other. We do have a question, but please, if you have anything, please put it into the Q&A, and I'll slip it into our conversation. Well, that does beg the question: do you have to like your subject? Would you find yourself giving up on a biography if you decided halfway through, this man's either, well, I won't say, I don't like this man, I don't wish to spend the next couple of years with him, or woman for that matter?
I think it becomes irrelevant whether you like them or not. It's sort of a bit like members of your own family. You know, would one like them if one met them as acquaintances? They are their part of the furniture. Having said that, I can't really imagine writing a biography of, well, let's say a Nazi, for example. I just would be so repelled by being in the company of somebody so horrible.
On the other hand, well, I've read four. I haven't read the Boswell and Johnson book, but I will come back to that. But of the four I've read, which is Le Carré, Trevor-Roper, A.J.P. Taylor, and the man who impersonates Parsons, they're all, how shall I, difficult, awkward, sometimes obstreperous. Are you attracted to that sort of character?
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because it had never occurred to me before. I think what I'm interested in is people I consider interesting, and perhaps they tend to be individualistic. I mean, they tend to be, well, idiosyncratic, perhaps is a better way of putting it, in one way or another. Actually, one of the common threads about most of the people I've written about is that they are all writers, and they all have very distinctive prose styles. And I think I am probably more interested in prose than most people.
That stimulates the thought, the worry that I have for biographers of the future. You talk about spending many hours with David Cornwell's memoirs, of going through Trevor-Roper's papers. I can't think the last time I wrote a letter. I've written lots and lots of emails, as Mary Agnes can attest. But how could biographers of the contemporary stars of our time going to manage without the voluminous letters that you've been able to use?
Well, I agree. It's going to be a huge problem, and perhaps biography will become obsolete. I mean, it's actually something I encountered with David Cornwell, with John le Carré, in that his earlier manuscripts were all typed on a manual typewriter with hand corrected. His later manuscripts were word processed, so you can't see the process of correction and the earlier drafts in the same way. And similarly, his letters, although he continued to handwrite personal letters, much of his business communication, his correspondence with his editors, for example, was done by email and is difficult, if not impossible, to retrieve. So I think it is going to be a major problem of the future. But who knows, that we may find other ways of communicating as yet unknown to us.
Do you still write letters?
Not very often, but I do write a few, yeah. Especially when I want to say something important.
Do you think we communicate differently when we sit down, pen and paper even, and write to a friend rather than, we do write long emails to friends, here's a catch up, long time no see, this is what I've been up to. You think there's a difference in the way we write?
I'm sure we do. I mean, to give an example, I'm sure you have had the same experience as me, being, similar vintage, writing letters, of consolation when someone has died. You wouldn't normally write that as an email. It's normally a handwritten letter. It's more personal, and you spend more time thinking about it. Perhaps quite often have 2 or 3 drafts, and I find before I find what seems to me appropriate. Because it's often very difficult to put in words the right emotion when someone has died. One's words can seem trite. So when you're trying to, love letter, I think love letters are probably better expressed on paper rather than in electronic form.
Let me put some questions that our audience are asking. The first one's very general. Of all your works, this is from an anonymous attendee, it's just they didn't want to go on mic, I guess. Of all your works, which has been the most intellectually challenging and why?
That's an interesting question. Well, I think probably the Trevor-Roper book, because I had to think quite deeply about history in a way that I hadn't done before, and in particular, kind of history that I was unfamiliar with, the early modern period. Having said all of that, what is at the heart of a lot of Trevor-Roper's writing is a great interest in the insights of Marx and neo-Marxist writers, but and ultimately a rejection of a determinist philosophy, an idea that history is predetermined, and that's and Trevor-Roper was very, very interested in economic and social causes of change, and fully accepted that these needed to be studied and were just as important as kings and queens, but or more important. But he didn't believe that all history is the history of class struggle, to put it in a very glib way.
There's a question from, I suspect somebody, Christopher Thompson. I don't know whether, Christopher, you'd like to ask your question live. If you would, you want to unmute yourself. If not, I'll read it. So I'll wait for a few moments. Are you wishing to ask it live? Well, let me ask it for you. It's very brief. In retrospect, do you think you gave enough attention to Trevor-Roper's immense sense of fun and satire?
I hope so. I mean, it's something I discovered, as it were. As I say, he was quite shy, but I gradually became aware of this, and I hope so. I'm always worried, of course, that I've will miss the joke, and I think an awful lot of biographers are. One of the hazards of biography is one tends to be writing about people who are cleverer than oneself, and so sometimes you will miss the subtleties of what they're writing. But I always found it stimulating to be in the company of people who are cleverer than oneself, and it stretches you. And I think it's something that we should always try and do. And as a matter of fact, although you might not think it, John le Carré is an extraordinarily clever man, and his. In fact, I remember his long-term American editor saying to me, who had edited a great many academics as well as other distinguished writers, that le Carré was perhaps the cleverest man he ever met. It's interesting.
He certainly get that impression from your biography. A question from somebody else who wants to remain anonymous, I'm sure, just for shyness rather than the question. But this is a chance for you to recoup your reputation as a lazy Sussex student, which was not my description, let me point it out. He thanks you, but people have said thank you for your talk, and it was fascinating, and I'll do that at the end. But he mentioned that he is, or she, terrible assumption by me, the questioner is a Sussex alumnus. Could you please describe how your time at Sussex influenced your career and practice as a biographer?
Oh, gosh. Not very much, I think, probably. But that's entirely my fault. It's not Sussex's fault. I went through a very lazy period where I just was enjoying myself. I did actually write a piece which appeared in the Observer in the 1990s about going back to Sussex after 25 years. And it was partly about what we felt then and what I felt now. I was a contemporary of a figure who had just become very much in the news, Andrew Morton, the royal biographer, who in fact turned up in his Bentley. And I inquired around the other people who were attending this event. Not a single one of us could remember Andrew Morton. I hope he's not listening. That was quite curious. Yeah.
Somebody's asked. Let me just answer it because it's organised. They're asking. They've arrived late. That's fine. Will the talk be available? Yes, it is going to be available. You will be able to find it on the festival website after it's been processed, and also on YouTube, I think. But you'll get details from the organisers. There was a question that. Goodness me, this makes me sound very ignorant. But I have not read. You have next on my reading list is Boswell's Life of Johnson. You made it sound compelling. I had two thoughts. One of which is completely trivial. All I knew of it was that wonderful Blackadder sketch where, do you recall? And I can't even remember if it's Boswell or Johnson who is speaking in that way that you described.
Yeah, Robbie Coltrane, isn't it? Who's playing?
That's right.
Johnson. Yes, and it's absolutely the caricature of the Johnson that Boswell evokes.
Yeah. It was brilliant.
Sort of pompous and sort of domineering fashion.
But it made me think of the Penguin edition of the book, and this is publishers, you will know this better than regards, but has Boswell's name bigger than Johnson. And that's always important, isn't it, that the author's name is bigger than the subject. Do we have a contemporary Boswell and Johnson?
Well, I could say it's not for me to say. No, I don't think one does. I mean, I think, that was an extraordinary book because it just catapulted the whole biography from being a very much a marginal discipline into being something much more serious. And Boswell somehow managed to produce this book that advanced biography without him really even knowing what he was doing, you might say. It's also a kind of essay, in a way, an autobiography, because, of course, as I said, he appears himself as a major figure in it. In fact, some people have said that he's really the hero of that book and that Johnson is just the background. But they are linked in this sort of curious way, like these famous pairings of, say, Holmes and Watson. And you can't really, because of that book, you can't really imagine them separated.
We would not know Johnson as a major literary figure were it not for Boswell. Is that right?
Well, Johnsonian scholars really hate that. But yes, it's true. I mean, the reason why he's become a legendary figure and that he's, far better known than any other 18th century writer, you might say. Well, perhaps not until Coleridge and Wordsworth, perhaps. But anyway,
who were just 18th century.
Yeah, is because of that book, and because he becomes not just a writer, but a character, a person. And that's what's so amazing about it, is you just feel that he really lives in that book.
I'd like to just talk a little bit about le Carré, because he's probably the author that most people will know about. You're right, working on the second edition. In what way is that going to be, if it is going to be, significantly different from the first edition, and why, if it is?
Well, I mean, for one thing, when my book was published, he was still alive, and he hadn't. He had several books that he hadn't then published. Several, and in fact, there is at least one more novel yet to be published posthumously. It's recently been announced that a novel of his will appear in October, but I know of at least one more book that may yet appear beyond that. So that's one thing, is that the events of the last 6 years and his involvement indeed in politics, including his very active involvement in the People's Vote campaign and trying to oppose Brexit. He absolutely loathed Brexit, and in fact seems to have later, towards the end of his life, to have taken out Irish nationality because of it. But more fundamentally, there was a lot that I had to leave out, both well, really because of writing about a living person, and in particular about his private life. So I alluded to the various affairs he'd had in general terms, but I didn't go, describe in any detail. I think his personal life is more interesting than, this is not just tittle tattle, it's very fundamental to trying to understand him. Because he kind of, for one thing, betrayal is a central subject in his writing. But for another, he seemed to kind of derive a kind of excitement from extramarital adventures, which was very similar to the excitement of spying. In fact, he used some of the same terminology. And indeed, made clandestine arrangements and used cutouts and so on and so forth. So it's all kind of, and it's also to do with his very complicated personality and his very troubled childhood, and the fact that he never really trusted women after his mother abandoned him at the age of 5.
Will we like him more? Will we like him less? Is he going to be more admired, less admired? What do you think the outcome of the second edition will be?
I wouldn't want him to be less admired as a writer. I think we will feel more, perhaps a bit more sympathy for him. No, in some ways, I think what you mean from a revised edition of his book.
Yeah.
Well, I suppose those who dislike him may have some ammunition, as it were, to fire at him. But I think I start from the point of view of being an admirer of his work, and I think what one wants to do really is to understand him, understand his very complicated personality, which produced several really major works, particularly in the 60s and 70s.
I remember we had a conversation a couple of years ago, which is how you come to be here, where you said his son had said to you, I think it was his son, when you were working on the first edition, but when he's passed away, you come back because we've got a story to tell you about him that you don't know, or words to that effect. Were you disappointed going back to the son? Did he tell you big things, apart from the odd affair that you weren't aware of?
Well, I'm still having those conversations, but no. Well, I mean, most of the information I'm gleaned about his private life comes from elsewhere, and seems to pop up in the most surprising ways. For example, I live here in Bristol. This is where I'm speaking from. At a party one night in Bristol, very late at night, I found myself talking to someone I'd never met before, who told me inter alia that he knew the daughter of someone that had had an affair with John le Carré. And I followed this up, and I found out quite a lot. And there's some letters, and there's some inscribed books, and indeed she's quite obviously, the mother of this woman is quite obviously the model for a character in the Honourable Silverware.
You do a lot of that in the book. Can you match virtually every character in a le Carré book to something you've come across in his real life?
Well, I think when these are not exact parallels. I don't think one can, with any novelist, one can say that's Ivor, that's Adam, etc., etc. But there's often an inspiration for a character, like, for example, people who are le Carré aficionados will be familiar with the character of Toby Esterhazy, who is a dapper Hungarian that Smiley has recruited into the circus. Well, Toby Esterhazy, is quite obviously modelled on the publisher André Deutsch, who was a dapper Hungarian, also very small, who was quite a comical figure in many ways, but also quite a remarkable man, who founded his own publishing house.
You mentioned in your talk that people, le Carré in particular, I can't remember if you referred also to Trevor-Roper, remember things vividly that didn't actually happen, or remember them wrongly, which is something I guess we all suffer from. Does that make it actually more difficult to interview, to have a live subject than somebody who's dead and buried and can't misremember?
Well, it does in the sense that you may be challenging them. I mean, le Carré certainly complained to me that I was questioning everything he told me. And I said, well, you yourself, David, have written that you are a liar. And so I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't question these things. But also there were things when he was, not deliberately trying to mislead me, but like the example I gave. And I think we all do this. I mean, I do it. I know I do it. And I've gone back and re-examined episodes from the past and found that my narrative is distorted. It doesn't fit the facts.
I'm afraid, I fear I might have told my students here at Sussex anecdotes about me when I was a student at Sussex that, if the record were checked, might be found to have not been exactly as I remembered them.
No, well, I think that's a very natural human process. And it's generally true that anecdotes become more polished with each retelling.
Indeed, we remember not the event, we remember last time we told the anecdote.
Yes, yes.
And as you say, we burnish it a little. I'm going to sort of find a final question. If somebody approached you and said, Mr. Sisman, I'm a real great admirer of your work, I would like to write your biography, what would you say?
I'd say, don't waste your time. My life is not very interesting.
That's exactly what Hugh Trevor-Roper said to you.
Well, it is. But of course, Hugh Trevor-Roper had an extraordinarily fascinating life. I mean, not least, of course, his involvement with Adolf Hitler, one of the major figures of the 20th century, for better or worse. I mean, just for those who don't know it, Trevor-Roper was charged at the end of the war with establishing whether Hitler was really dead, and conducted an investigation on behalf of the Allied powers, including visiting the bunker and interviewing every surviving person he could find, from individual sentries to Albert Speer. And he wrote a report and then a best-selling book based on this. And then many years later, in the 1980s, he was asked to verify what appeared to be Hitler's diaries, and he gave a tentative opinion that they were genuine, and was perhaps the most humiliating episode in an academic career I know of.
And that is what he's remembered for in common parlance, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, if you wanted to paraphrase my book in one sentence, you might say Hitler made him and Hitler unmade him. But of course, there's much more to him than that.
There is indeed, as anybody will find out reading your very complete life of Hugh Trevor-Roper, not to mention the others. And quick commercial, your new version of le Carré's life is out, we hope, next year.
Yes, we hope, yes.
Adam Sisman, Sussex graduate, brackets, lazy, but nonetheless made quite a name for yourself. Thank you very much for joining us. And I hope you'll come and visit us some stage in sunny Brighton. Thank you very much. And to the rest of you, thank you very much for joining the talk. There's lots more happening on the Sussex Festival Ideas, details on the website. But for now, goodbye.